Aparasachit Sukhavari Rashe Yasyor Mimatram Bhuvanam Samastam Guhahitam Tam Ramanam Gabiram Chinta Vihinam Hridi Chintayami. Namaste again, and welcome to the AAPNA conference. I'm very humbled to speak before you, and I'm very happy to be with you here today. And first I want to make some acknowledgements. We work a lot in India, and we go back and forth and teach there and interact with a lot of groups. And we have to say that 2014 is the most important year for India since 1947. And many teachers, many gurus, as well as social political figures have been working for a change in the society and the culture of the country. And that has occurred in this year, 2014, with the recent change of government. And there is one great guru who is one of the greatest spiritual architects of this modern change, of this current change in India this year, who is Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. So we really have to admire the work that he has done in that regard. And secondly, here we have the great honor to have the presence of one of the great fathers of yoga in the West, who is still one of the leading lights and guides of the yoga movement in the West. Some of these other great teachers have passed on, but he is still with us, teaching and inspiring people more than ever, who is Gurudev Amrit Desai. And it is very important that anyone who hasn't seen him or worked with him, and even those who have, spend as much time and look into his new Yoga and Ayurveda University. And the third is Dr. Shaker, who may or may not be here because he is so busy, but for providing the inspiration, the motivation, and motivating all of us and all the other people to produce conferences like this, and to keep this entire Ayurveda movement going, and also to direct it more towards the field of yoga as well. So I have an interesting topic today: continuity of Veda, Raja Yoga, and Ayurveda, which means I can speak on almost anything. Broad enough topic. But I do want to emphasize these points. And also it was mentioned today the idea of a Panchanga Veda Ayurveda conference, with the 5 limbs being yoga, Ayurveda, Jyotish, Vastu, and Gandharva Veda. And I may come back, I'll come back to that a little bit more later, but that is part of the same stream of ideas that we are working with. It's interesting, I did not start my practices, teachings, etc. so directly with Ayurveda. I started it in a very strange way, which was with the mantras of the Rig Veda. I began translating the Rig Veda in my 20s, and my first publications were translations and yogic studies of the Rig Veda that came out through the Sri Aurobindo ashram starting in beginning of 1980. So I've always found or looked to a Vedic foundation of all these teachings. What is Veda and why Veda? Veda is the mantras of the great rishis of India many, many thousands of years ago, perhaps 5,000 years ago or more. But mantras written in a mantric language, which means they're not written in modern English, they're not written in a philosophical or logical language. They are written in a language of sound, symbol, poetry, and deeper levels of meaning. And so I would have to say that today there is yet not a single reliable translation or study of Rig Veda, and which is the core of the Vedic teachings, except if we go back to the work of some of the great yogis like Sri Aurobindo or Kavyakanta Ganapati Muni or Kapali Shastri, or even to some extent Swami Dayananda of the Arya Samaj, who took a deeper level or deeper examination to the Vedas. So the Vedas are not easily accessible. The main access we have to the Vedas are the two mantras that so many yoga people do. One is the Gayatri mantra of the Rishi Vishwamitra, and the other is the Triambakam mantra of the Rishi Vasishta. But these are only two of the 10,000 verse mantras that we have in the Rig Veda. And all 10,000 of them have similar meanings and applications. And what do the Vedas relate to? They relate to certain primary deities, devatas, or forms of light. And they're very simple. First is Agni, the fire principle that we all know. Second is complementary to the Agni is the Soma principle, the water or the Amrit, the nectar principle that complements Agni. For every form of Agni, there is also a form of Soma. Third, the solar principle, the Surya, the light principle. We all know the sun. But the sun not just simply as an outer light, the sun also as an inner light. And fourth, the Vayu, the prana, or the Vidyut, the electrical principle, which is also known as the Indra principle, or the supreme lord and ruling power, what can also be called Ishvara. And if you know anything about Ayurveda, Agni, Pitta, Soma, Kapha. Vayu, Vidyut, of course, is Indra is the Vata dosha. And the Surya, the solar principle, is the balancing or the integration of all these principles. Then these principles exist not only on the outside, they also exist on the inside. In one of the Upanishads, I think it is the Maitri, it says that the sun is twofold as outer and inner. The inner sun is prana, and the measurement of the inner sun is measured by the movements of the outer sun, meaning we have 10,000 breaths by day and by night, one breath every 4 seconds approximately, and a whole study of the prana principle. Now, most of you have studied this concept of 7 chakras and the subtle body, which is very prominent in the tantric yogas of later times. And sometimes it's regarded as having been created or introduced there. It's actually much older. And we also find that in the use a lot in the Ayurveda today and in a lot of the yoga principles and classes. But in the tantric thought, going back to the Vedas, the 3 lower chakras are connected to the Agni principle, which is the foundation of the Kundalini Shakti. Kundalini Shakti is an Agni force. Agni relates to speech. Kundalini is made up of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, which reflect the prime qualities of cosmic sound. Kundalini is the ascending fire force. Its foundation is the Muladhara. Its flame dwells in the Swadhisthana, and its light comes forth from the Manipura. That's why these 3 chakras are always closely connected. And complementary to the Agni force is always the Soma force. And in the yogic thought, the Soma, the moon, the Amrit is a name and description of the Sahasrar, or the 1,000-petaled lotus of the head. And the whole inner practice of yoga, Kundalini yoga, tantric yoga, But even the Vedic yoga is the Agni Soma ritual, the Antaryaga, or the inner sacrifice, which occurs through the ascending fire of the Agni from below and the descending flow of grace or the divine nectar from the 1,000-petal lotus above, and their eventual unity and unification on various levels. Everything in the universe is comprehended by the Agni and Soma. Tantric yoga, Agni is Shakti, and the Soma principle is the Shiva principle. We won't go into all the details and complications of this approach, but it's important to understand that yoga arises from the Vedas as this inner sacrifice of transformation of energy. The ascending Agni purifies and burns up the negative samskaras, the ego, the unconscious nature, the instinctual nature connected particularly to the lower chakras. The descending Soma brings about the rejuvenation of the mind and the nervous system. It brings about the reawakening of the higher self, the Atma or Purusha. These are also balancing as fire-water principles, Pitta Kapha principles, Agni Soma at a deeper level, which are the inner essences of the Kapha and the Pitta. So in other words, the key to the Vedic mantras and the key to yogic, psychic, and psychological transformation is there in the mantras of these Vedic rishis going back more than 5,000 years. And through yoga and through mantra, teaching us how to raise our awareness, how to reach a higher level of consciousness beyond the body and beyond the mind. And this is very amazing because when you consider 5,000 years ago or more, there weren't any scientists there, or they were a different type of scientist, we might say. The world was very different, but our human consciousness had the same potential, and that legacy was passed on down to us through the Vedic teachings. Now, the Vedic teachings are embodied in the philosophy of the Vedanta, which is the fundamental philosophy and teaching behind all the yogic, all the Ayurvedic teachings. Every student of yoga and Ayurveda should also learn the fundamentals of Vedanta. What we call the Sankhya system and its 25 tattvas is nothing but a summary of the main cosmological principles of the Vedantic thought that we find in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And the key principle behind all these Vedic, Upanishadic, and yogic teachings extending to Ayurveda is what? Purusha. The Purusha principle. Purusha, Atman, consciousness and awareness. In the modern world, we tend to identify through science, brain, mind, and consciousness, and try to change consciousness through altering the chemistry of the brain. Now, that's the basis of a lot of these new breakthroughs in psychology, psychiatry, a lot of these modern new designer drugs, and so forth. But Veda and Vedanta teaches us that the brain is one thing, the mind is another, and consciousness is something else. And here we can see very simply that the brain is the instrument for the mind. The mind is the instrument for consciousness. Brain connecting to the body and the sense organs is the outer instrument of the Atma or Purusha within. It's sort of like your car or your automobile. It can allow you to go places in the outer or material world. But it is an instrument. You know, if we look at our arms and legs and all the rest of it, you can see they are clearly instruments. And it's also interesting to note that we are aware of ourselves as a whole person or as a conscious being. And you'll note that even if we are physically impaired, if a person loses a limb, an arm, a leg, whatever is paralyzed, they still feel like a whole person and want to be treated like a whole person. So that principle of consciousness is the Purusha, that principle of self. And the mind then is the inner instrument. Memory, sensation, emotion, logic, thought. These are all activities at a subtle, energetic level of the mind. But these are all activities that we can, just as we can witness external objects, we can also witness internal objects. We can observe the fluctuation of our emotions. We can observe the different types of thought, change of opinions, beliefs, perceptions, philosophy. We can even observe our self-image. You know, the biggest illusion and perhaps the biggest joke that we play on ourselves is our self-image. Why? Because if you're a self, how can you have an image? The image is of your body and how it looks at a particular point in time and space. The self can have no image. Self is not an image. Self is the perceiver of the image. Self is not an object. Self is a subject. Self has no, cannot be identified, but it is able to identify everything else. So the mind works by a deeper light of consciousness, and that is the Atma or Purusha of the Vedic thought. And the Vedic thought is rooted upon what I call the Purusha principle, and this is very simple. The entire universe is one conscious being, universal Purusha. The manifest worlds are the body of that Purusha. Purusha is the inner self of that. And each one of us is a replica of the entire universe. The entire universe, our inner consciousness pervades